Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. March of Progress, written by Radius55. 3 minutes to jump, all hands, prepare for translation in 3 minutes. The cool but insistent voice didn't quite startle Lex Collins. Then again, nothing had really startled him in quite some time, but the announcement did prompt him to triple-check the fighter's pre-flight diagnostic and verify the status of the rest of his squadron. As he did, a corner of his mind reflected on the events that led to this moment. After all, he was about to hurl himself into the vacuum turned briefly to atmosphere by plasma beams, antimatter blasts, and vaporized debris, with nothing but a fragile fighter to protect him, and needed any distraction from the coming storm. Who started the war depended a lot on who you asked. The Bryonet Republic certainly funded pirates around the contested systems to harass human shipping. Terran ships fired the first official shots when the foreign cruiser attempted to intervene in their harassment of merchants, suspected to be disguised Q ships. In any event, the fighting that was called a war at the same time was a mere skirmish compared to what was to come. The Terrans and the Bryonets were roughly equal in terms of both technology and overall fleet size. Pressed, most analysts would admit the Terran Confederation was at a slight disadvantage, being a few years behind in several key areas and having fewer star systems to their name. It wasn't particularly surprising that the initial Bryonic thrust captured all contested planets and a pair of originally human-held worlds. They were perfectly willing to stop there, keeping the captured area as compensation for the wrongs humanity had inflicted, perceived or otherwise. The Confederation refused, so the Bryonic forces took another human-held world at the cost of a few ships, then a second in return for several capital ships and a squadron of escorts. At the third, their fleet was crushed by an equally large and substantially better armed TCN task force. Within 6 months, humanity had retaken every captured planet as well as the contested systems. And, at each battle, their craft seemed more capable, faster, better armed, heavier shields, improved sensors, and countermeasures. Bryan at High Command was baffled as to why the humans had kept these ships in reserve for so long, and how they remained hidden all this time. It was only after the TSN had captured 7 Biotic systems and was threatening their capital that they sued for peace, and the galaxy found out the truth. In a mere 14 months of combat, human technology leapt most of a generation. It was this revolution, more than anything else, which put the universe on the path that put Lex where he was today. 90 seconds to jump, all crew, secure for transit. Repeat, all crew. Lex turned that channel out. He was already in position, and his sensors told him down to the microsecond the time left to the wormhole entry. A quick check showed his diagnostics returned all systems were in the green. Reports from the rest of the squadron told the same story. Good crew, he said to himself. Not like we haven't been together for quite a while, though, Lex finished sardonically. The incredible scientific progress of humanity in those short years of war frightened many species to no end. Not the fact that progress occurred, per se, or even its speed. Similar advances had been made, especially by younger species. None of them drew more than a cursory remark. It was the fact humanity accomplished this leap during a time of war that frightened them. More so, an inspection of the pre-contact history showed this pattern throughout, with periods of turmoil tending to also be great times of progress. It was the general consensus of one powerful group that humans were uniquely suited for war, and this scared them. 18 months later, an alliance of 12 species invaded the Terran system of New Fredericksburg, having no more than a pair of destroyers and a light cruiser for anti-piracy patrols. The local government signaled their surrender without firing a shot. The response was a barrage of high-yield antimatter-tipped missiles aimed for the center of the human habitation. For only the 3rd time in history, a xenocide had been sanctioned against a species whose mere existence presented a danger to all others. And while they had never read The Prince, the Alliance knew better than to do an enemy a small injury. Humanity's losses did not stop at the first battle of New Fredericksburg. 5 systems were sterilized in a month before the TCN could organize a counterattack. The defense of Pacifica resembled nothing more than an orgy of mutual destruction. An outnumbered and outgunned human fleet. For a while, that advanced beyond the Bryonets. Humans were still not an equal on the galactic technology. Spent itself in the sole goal of taking as many of their killers, of their friends, family, and fellow man as they could. In the final tally, only 2 TCN ships survived with less than a catastrophic damage, and the planet had been hammered by several bombardment projectiles. But the Alliance's advance had been halted. In the year of skirmishes that followed, 32 naval ships, 83 merchant vessels, 3 more planets, and almost 7 billion humans were lost. But this was a small injury compared to the total size of the human holdings. On the 1-year anniversary of word of the attack reaching Earth, the fleet struck back. A TCN force, now the technological equals of their foes, brushed aside the forces picketing 3 Alliance worlds to burn them to ash. Having been taught well, they were very thorough. It was their worst fear come true. Wormholes established, all system screens secure for imminent translation. Came the call over the communicator. Creating an instantaneous link between 2 points in space was no small feat. In fact, early models required the annual output of a main sequence star to be brought online for a few minutes. This model only needed a few days' worth to initialize, and could be held open nearly indefinitely thereafter for relatively little cost. Lex studied the structures floating nearby in the void as his ride raced to the tear in space-time. 0-point energy extractors fed power to a moon-sized bank of hypercapacitors. These supplied the energy to 4 massive wormhole generators, all active while coming online. Gathered nearby each gate were mobile shipyards, fleet colliers and resupply craft, vast freighters, and combat craft of all sizes. Every craft from the smallest recon drone to the supermassive dreadnoughts to Lex himself was there for one purpose, and one purpose alone. And that purpose was coming up rapidly ahead as the carrier TCNS Malta approached the gash in space. Unfortunately for humanity, the alliances represented only a small fraction of the forces in the galaxy. But with several major powers handed their heads by the suddenly exceptionally well-armed humans, many of the previously neutral species were shocked out of inaction. Perhaps those original alliance members were right, they thought. Maybe humanity was a danger to all sentient life. So it came to pass that the shaky state of the ceasefire that had been maintained for the better part of 2 months was broken by a combined fleet of 12 times the size of one of the alliances had first thrown against the TCN. Human fleets spent themselves like water to try and halt the oncoming tide. In several cases, they managed to stow it, buying precious months to organize resistance. At the Battle of Circus Belt, 6 destroyers stood off a full task force long enough for every miner to evacuate, along with several megatons of refined heavy metals for the war effort. During the Second Hyperion, a wing of fighters met and defeated 8 times their number in the largest dogfight in history. A group of civilians with nothing but converted freighters and the rechristened surplus cruisers Alamo Goliad held the planet of New Texas for 2 weeks against repeated enemy attacks. Their sacrifices became the same sort of legend as had the references put by their namesakes in centuries past. In a dozen systems across 100 light years, humanity fought the Horde in any way they could. Months turned into years as the war became one of attrition, but regardless of their rate of battle spawned technological advances. This was a war that humanity could not win. They were simply faced with an unstoppable wave of personnel and ships. It didn't matter that a lone destroyer could take on a dreadnought with a fair chance of success if the enemy had 5 dreadnoughts for every TCN escort. Still, humanity battled, and still their enemies advanced. In the late days of the war, TCN ships had cloaking fields capable of hiding small moons, an acceleration curve that left a supercarrier maneuver like a corvette, and weapons that could not have been imagined by any sentient being mere years before. Manufactories using power drawn directly from the cores of stars supplied the fleet with parts and craft, while neural uploads of the greatest strategies, engineers, and scientists designed and refined plans for ever more capable craft. And it was not enough. So it came to pass that 7 Terran years after the first shots were fired by the Brynard ship, an alliance fleet to dwarf any in existence arrived at the recently settled outworld of Suribaki. They forced the remains of the fleet that had held their full strength at bay for 3 years. In decades to come, species could see signs of the battle that flowed with their naked eyes, or they would have, if the flashes hadn't been drawn out by the light of an exploding star as the last defenders of the system forced the local primary to go nova, destroying themselves along with a large chunk of the attacking fleet. But the fall of Sarabachi marked the end of human resistance in the Milky Way. A few remaining hideouts lasted some years to come, but were eventually all hunted down and exterminated. The powers of the Alliance breathed a sigh of relief, and humanity passed into the realm of a boogeyman invoked to frighten children into eating their vegetable analogues. Well, this boogeyman is back, and wants his pound of flesh. Lex watched through a dozen senses as the blackness of space gave way to a tunnel of non-existence, jarring most of the crew. Don't see the problem, he thought to himself, though Lex had to admit that the tunnel, both infinitely long and no length at all, was a bit disorienting. Still, nothing to write home about. But as fast as it begun, the ride was over. Only now, the carrier was 2.5 million and some change light years from where it had been seconds before. Then, the command to launch rang out, and Lex was back in black. There was no discredit of the Alliance that they missed it. After all, human cloaking technology at the time of the Battle of Suribachi was incredibly good, and against the glare of a dying star there were few sensors that could have hoped to see 20 well-hidden ships slip through a tear in space, since all such sensors belonged to the TCN, and the tear itself was only possible through the power of a nova. The Alliance could be forgiven in this one instance. Those ships contained the best and brightest of humanity. Some were in cryogenic suspension, others in the form of frozen genetic tissue, sperm and ova. Still more existed only as electronic copies of consciousness, their bodies dead or dying to secure their escape. These ships made the transit to the Andromeda galaxy in a blink of an eye. There, they began building anew. For 250 years, the surviving Terrans regrew. Of the Andromeda species, they avoided most. They were contacted, but merely to assure that they were not planning on staying. For the most part, humans bided their time until they could rebuild. Ships were designed and built, unexplored areas of science were opened and applied to the art of war. A new generation of man was sired, both from the stored genetic material and via more traditional techniques. And once humanity had risen from the ashes of near annihilation, the time to return the favor came. Lex nailed the throttle and accelerated past towards the fleet ahead of him at well over 10,000 Gs. The force didn't bother him at all, except as they somewhat stressed the super-strong frame of the craft. This is Lex Actual, all systems nominal, he reported back to the flight ops through his dedicated FTL link, continuing to target Alpha. From the visual sensors, light quickly took on a blue tinge as he and his squadron approached relativistic speeds in mere minutes. The shields registered minor impacts as micrometeors hit with an energy of small nuclear detonations. These were shrugged off with minimal effort. The fire from the ships ahead posed somewhat more danger. Lex was forced to engage his phase drive to avoid a blast of plasma from a dreadnought's main gun. The relatively recent invention allowed his fighter to shift out of the normal plane of existence for a short period, letting the deadly mass pass harmlessly through the space that his craft still theoretically occupied. He remembered fighting these bastards back in the war, albeit with a much less capable fighter. Still, they weren't quite as tough and nut as they appeared. A few squadrons of old human attack craft could knock one out in short order. Now, Lex zeroed in on the target of his wrath and fired a few blasts from his primary cannon, following with a heavy missile. The blasts of focused quantum energy tore through the dreadnought shields and hull. Exotic energy in the warhead detonated an order of magnitude more energetically than would simply antimatter. The offending ship seemed to disintegrate as Lex pulled speed through the remains of the quickly crumbling fleet. He snapped off a few shots at passing ships, but held his missiles for more worthy targets. As soon as he was clear of the new asteroid belt, he opened up comm channel. "Hops, this is Lex Actual. Alpha Delta 4 is breaking up, and the rest of Alpha is pretty much toast." "Roger, Lex. Alpha confirmed combat ineffective," came the reply from the First Operations Control. "Shift to Beta Prime immediately." "Roger, Ops. Altering course." He shifted vectors and sent his new flight information to Command and the rest of his squadron. Then he switched his backup radio transmitter. "Kill my family!" he broadcasted in the clear. "Attack my species!" The rest of his squadron vectored in, -2 caught by an unavoidable shots from the multiple capital ships. Not that the loss bothered any of them. "Destroy my body!" The virtual consciousness of what was once Lieutenant Colonel Lex Collins TCN ace fighter pilot and posthumous winner of the Solar Cross, augured towards the now panicking High Command down below as the 9 remaining copies of his mind formed up around him. Nearby, several similar squadrons, each composed of the minds of some of the greatest pilots who ever lived and died, formed up for their attack runs on the once human-held world below, with as much simultaneity as was possible, given the limits sometimes imposed, but often sneered at, by the speed of light. Each fighter launched. For he would occasionally stumble. The march of progress will continue forever on. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Lord Azrakal, Dragzoon WRE, Holly Sister, Ambrose Cattell, and Quantum Wednesday. Thank you very much.